When the COVID-19 pandemic hit the United States, I was a senior in high school. We left for spring break, and before that first weekend was even over, we were told that school had been canceled indefinitely. No goodbyes, no gradual transitions, just gone. And not very long after that, something very strange started to happen. Across the country, parents, coaches, and communities were chanting the same exact thing. Let them play. At the time, I didn't understand this at all. I loved sports, and I still do to this day. I play basketball for fun and just to get some exercise, but growing up, running was my thing. Track, cross country. I broke my middle school track record for the 2-mile. I ran varsity as a freshman all throughout my senior year, and in my senior year, I was training rather seriously. I had a real shot at my school's 1-mile record, that is, before COVID canceled the season, of course. And this record was something like 4 minutes and 30-some-odd seconds, set many decades ago. And at the beginning of the season, when I was running my 5Ks, I was hitting 5 minutes flat on my first mile, still anticipating those 2 miles ahead. So all of this to say, I certainly wasn't a slouch. But before this all starts sounding too impressive, I do want to mention that my graduating class was like 55 people, so it's not exactly like making varsity was all that difficult to do. I mainly just want to establish a little bit of credibility that I'm not just some soy, as some of my commenters might report. But even with all of that, I thought that the Let Them Play movement was pretty much insane. People were dying. Hospitals were getting completely overwhelmed, and reopening sports during a global pandemic felt, well, stupid, quite frankly, and I still think it was a bad idea. But over time, I started to realize something somewhat uncomfortable, which was that I didn't understand why people were so desperate for sports to come back, and that probably meant that I didn't understand what sports actually are, or what they're really for. There is a very strong attitude in some academic and intellectual circles that sports are trivial, violent, anti-intellectual, dumb jock stuff. What real value could a game possibly have to society, somebody might ask. But here's the thing. I was in sports and the arts. I was in band and choir. I was the drumline captain for several years, and I was in our school's madrigal choir that you had to audition for or whatever. I was in theater with musicals and plays. I had a couple of lead roles. I played Judas in Godspell my senior year, and I watched how both sides, the jocks and the arts club kids or whatever, basically just kind of resented each other, especially in rural schools where funding always has to come from somewhere. My own high school spent a couple $1 million on an AstroTurf football field just for us to go 1-7 every season. Meanwhile, our marching band wore uniforms that were purchased, I think, in the 1980s or 90s. So, I get the frustration, I get the resentment. But I also think that something important gets missed when we simply dismiss sports as meaningless without any further examination. And this video is pretty much about that mistake. Why sports and play matter. Why human beings willingly impose these pointless obstacles on ourselves. And what philosophers have been trying to tell us about games, rules, fairness, and meaning, often without anyone really noticing. Okay, so if it's not too much to ask, for just a moment, I want you to try and remove the virus from the pandemic. Remove the public health dangers and the death toll from the equation. Just look at the picture itself. Gyms shut down. Sports seasons are canceled. There's no games, no practices, no competition. Something about that picture felt very deeply wrong to people. So the question is, why? Why do human beings value sports, or games, or play in general? Now, one easy answer is pretty obvious. Sports produce things that we want, like glory, honor, respect, or maybe just fun, right? And if you're lucky enough or talented enough to reach the professional level, you get things like wealth, fame, and status that most people only ever dream about. A lot of people play sports for those reasons, and I'm not denying that for a second, but that just can't be the whole story. Most people who play sports will simply never be famous. They'll never make any real money at it. They'll never be remembered outside of a small circle of teammates and friends, and yet they still play religiously, passionately, and sometimes obsessively. So maybe the important question here isn't necessarily what sports give us, but what they're for. And this is where philosophy really helps, because it forces us to separate the extrinsic goods from the intrinsic goods. Extrinsic goods are those things that you can get in a lot of different ways, like money, power, or prestige. Intrinsic goods, on the other hand, are goods that you can only get by participating in a particular activity well. This distinction is very central to the work of Alasdair MacIntyre, who argues that human activities such as chess, medicine, architecture, and crucially to us, sports, are what he calls practices. We talking about practice.
We talking about practice.
A practice is a cooperative and socially established activity with internal standards of excellence. You don't get the goods of the practice unless you submit yourself to those standards. And as it pertains to us here, that means that you cannot get the best things that sports offer without accepting their constraints. The rules are not obstacles to excellence, they are what makes excellence possible in the first place. And this lines up almost perfectly with Bernard Suit's famous idea that games are the voluntary attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles. Running a mile as fast as you can is unnecessary. Playing basketball under a specific set of rules is unnecessary. And yet, within those unnecessary constraints, something very meaningful emerges. You get discipline, fairness, courage, mutual recognition. These are not side effects to the game, they are the entire point. When external goods start to dominate, or when winning at all costs, money, celebrity, or branding eclipse the internal standards, the practice begins to erode. Cheating, doping, flopping, exploitation. These aren't just rule violations. They're signs that the activity is no longer being treated as a practice at all. MacIntyre says that institutions are necessary to sustain practices, but they're also always tempted to corrupt them. And this framework explains something else important about the pandemic. When sports disappeared, people didn't just lose entertainment, they lost access to a practice, one of the few places left in modern life where excellence, effort, and shared standards are still publicly intelligible. That's why the loss of sports felt different from the loss of movies, concerts, or going out to eat at a restaurant. And another thing is that sports don't just entertain us, they give us heroes. Athletes really are, or perhaps used to be, depending on how you look at it, the modern heroes. In our current age, we don't champion people like Alexander the Great or some conqueror anymore. The only king we worship in this house is LeBron fucking James. Year 23. Hashtag grays in my beard. Hashtag kid from Akron. Hashtag pouring honey on the goat. People who push their bodies and minds to the absolute limit and show us what human beings are truly capable of. They make that kind of possibility visible to the public eye. Sports are also shockingly powerful at creating community. As Dr. Robert Sapolsky points out in this book, as well as several of his lectures, sports team affiliation can override racial and social divisions in ways that few other identities can. This is actually represented by scientific data. Can you believe that? I mean, we've been trying to overcome racism for centuries, and it turns out that the cure this whole time was to just collectively shit on the Dallas Cowboys. We gather at sports bars and tailgate in parking lots while flying flags in our yard. We ride or die for teams that sometimes have nothing to do with where we live, who we are, where we were born, or where we grew up. The emotional investment is very intense, but the real-world cost is relatively low. If my team loses, my life doesn't fall apart, and that makes sports a uniquely safe place to invest hope, loyalty, and identity. But beneath all of that, beneath the fandom and the heroes and community, is something even harder to articulate, which is what sports teach you when you actually play them. Teamwork, effort, accountability, when to take responsibility and when to pass the ball, how to lose, how to win without humiliating others, how to deal with unfairness without becoming unfair yourself. These are virtues that sports are uniquely well suited to cultivate, and this is probably why Albert Camus once said something to the effect that he learned more about morality from playing goalkeeper than he did from studying ethics. When you're playing goalkeeper, there's nowhere to hide. Your mistakes are very public. Your responsibility is immediate, and the lesson is embodied in a very visceral way. That, I think, is what most people didn't know how to properly say during the pandemic. They weren't just defending games, they were defending one of the few places where character, excellence, and meaning are still learned the hard way, through rules that we choose, obstacles we don't need, and losses that we agree to endure. So if you're following me so far, then that call to let them play stops sounding like just a cheap slogan and starts sounding like a legitimate philosophical problem. Why does running a mile matter? There's no practical reason to do it. It doesn't keep you alive in the way that it might have 10,000 years ago during the Neolithic period. It doesn't really solve any problems for us. You don't get anywhere any faster in your daily life because you can run a mile in 5 minutes instead of 6. And yet, when I was running track, that mattered to me immensely. Part of what makes sports so uniquely good at developing character is that they give you clear goals and standards to work toward. In track, I had my PR, my personal record. The goal was very simple: beat myself. In team sports, the standards are distributed across roles. For instance, in basketball, your point guard might be judged by playmaking and assists, and your big man by rebounds and rim protection. Obviously, everybody shares the collective goal of winning, but you also get something that's pretty rare in the modern life, which is a way to point at your contribution and say, this is what I did today. Sports give us feedback that is very immediate and honest. You can see improvement just as much as you can see stagnation. You can watch your effort turn into results or fail to. As much as I love learning and academia, I'll be honest, there's very few essay grades or test scores that I've received over years that have given me the same kind of pride as watching my jump shot slowly stop being complete ass. Learning has improved my life in ways that sports can really never even touch, but progress in sports is much easier to identify and quantify. And I think that this is pretty much a universal thing about humans, is that we love hard standards. We love evidence. It's much easier to put numbers to basketball than it is to personal growth. And I think this alone can explain some of sports' appeal, but it's definitely not the strangest part, because all of this really only works because the rules make it harder. And this is where philosophy helps us get very precise. Johann Huizinga draws a broad distinction between play and everything else that we do. Play is voluntary. It's set apart from ordinary life. It has its own rules and meanings. It doesn't aim at survival or material gain. Children pretending, animals play fighting, ritual dances, games, all of that counts as play. Sport is not the origin of play, it's one of play's most structured descendants. And Bernard Suits takes this even further in The Grasshopper, a book he wrote in the format of a Socratic dialogue. Not all play is a game. A game, for Suits, is a voluntary attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles in order to achieve a goal. And a sport is a game that adds physical skill, stable rules, and institutional structure. So the hierarchy looks something like this. Play comes first. Games give it structure, and sports harden that structure into something repeatable and comparable. And this is very important to understanding and explaining the heart of sports. The rules are not obstacles to excellence, they're what makes excellence possible in the first place. You're not allowed to do whatever works. You have to work within the constraint. According to Suits, every game has two kinds of goals, even if we don't usually notice the distinction. First, there's what he calls the pre-lusory goal, and this is just the physical outcome that you're aiming at. In golf, it's getting the ball in the hole. In track, it's crossing the finish line. In basketball, it's putting the ball through the hoop. Importantly, you could achieve all of these outcomes without playing the game at all. You could just drop a golf ball into the hole with your hand. You could just cross a finish line on a motorcycle. You could put a basketball gently into the rim using a ladder. But if you did that, no one would say that you played the game at all. And that's because games also have a second goal, the lusory goal, which is simply winning. And winning can only exist once you accept the rules of the game. You don't win golf by getting the ball in the hole by any means necessary. You win by getting it in the hole the right way, using deliberately inefficient methods that the rules force you to use. So, games don't just give you a goal, they also forbid the most efficient ways of reaching it. The rules intentionally make success harder than it needs to be, and those restrictions are not accidents or limitations, they are the game. Suits calls the permitted methods lusory means and the forbidden shortcuts illusory means. Illusory means would without a doubt get the job done faster and more efficiently, but they destroy the activity by bypassing the challenges that the game is built around. And the part that matters to us here is that to actually be playing a game, you have to accept those restrictions for their own sake, not because you're afraid of punishment or because you want a reputation for sportsmanship, but because without those constraints, there's no game at all. Suits calls this commitment the lusory attitude. It's the attitude that says, I could make this easier, but I won't, because the difficulty is the point. The rules are not obstacles to excellence. Again, they are what makes excellence possible in the first place. You are not allowed to do whatever works. You have to work within that constraint, and the paradox of the situation is that's precisely where creativity comes from. There's a lot of good psychological research out there showing that humans are often more creative when the options are limited. When you don't have every tool available, you become more resourceful. Constraints, then, don't really stifle ingenuity, it kind of provokes it, and that's basically the entire story of human intelligence. And as it turns out, there's a great example of this in basketball history. I didn't learn this until recently, but apparently dribbling wasn't originally a central feature of the game the way that James Naismith envisioned it. The early rules required players to stop moving once they caught the ball and then pass it. That was all fine and dandy until some asshole on Yale's team in 1897 realized that there was a loophole where he could just kind of pass the ball to the floor and then back up to himself. But it's important to note here that dribbling didn't emerge because the rules were loose. It emerged because the rules were tight. The constraint forced innovation, and now we have Kyrie Irving. What the hell is going on there, man? And this is true far beyond sports. You don't get Einstein's equations without the constraints of the scientific method. You don't get Beethoven's symphonies unless you first understand a little bit of Western music theory. You need rules to know what counts as breaking them. You need structure to discover possibility. That's why games require rules in the first place. Without shared constraints, participation just kind of disappears. I'm reminded of this Reddit event that this guy did where he had thousands of users collectively play a game of chess, but they were allowed to make legal moves as well as illegal moves. And so by the end, these pieces were time traveling and occupying multiple dimensions. The game completely disintegrated, which is exactly what you would expect. It was completely incoherent. No rules means no game, but more importantly, No meaning. And this is where Huizinga's seminal work Homo Ludens enters the picture again, because in that text, he argues that play isn't a childish extra that gets layered on top of culture. Play is extremely foundational. It's one of the few ways humans create order, meaning, and shared worlds. We step into a rule-bound space on purpose, knowing that it doesn't keep us alive because it teaches us how to live together. And this is exactly what games and sports do at their best. They create artificial constraints and then show us what is achievable within them. They turn abstract possibility into embodied proof. They make excellence visible. They teach us again and again that limits are often invitations rather than permanent walls. That's why human beings are drawn to challenges that don't keep us alive. We're not just trying to survive, we're trying to discover what we can do once the rules are set. And here's where I gotta disagree with my homeboy Richard Dawkins, because in this sense, I don't think that we're just survival machines. We're meaning-making creatures. We willingly impose constraints on ourselves because within those constraints, excellence becomes possible, and without them, nothing is earned. That's what games really are, not escapes from reality, but small structured worlds where our effort and progress is visible and it matters, and where success actually means something. In this way, and I mean this in like the most serious, sincere way possible, sports are practice for being a human being. One way to see what sports really are is to ask what kinds of excellence can only exist inside of a sport. There's no real value outside of baseball in being able to hit a ball with a bat. That skill just does not transfer cleanly into survivability or productivity, and yet the level of excellence that athletes achieve is genuinely awe-inspiring. I don't know much about baseball, but we'll continue with it just for the sake of cohesion here. MLB hitters can read pitch velocity, spin, trajectory, and placement all within fractions of a second, and they adjust their bodies mid-swing to hit the ball precisely where they want it to go. And before they've even done all of this, they've decided whether or not a home run, a bunt, or a base hit is going to be the most efficient at any given moment. That kind of precision simply does not exist in isolation. It only exists inside the practice of baseball. I think basketball is a little bit easier to see this kind of excellence to the naked human eye. What makes Steph Curry extraordinary isn't just that he shoots threes with sheer volume. It's the consistency, the arc, the release timing, the footwork, the awareness of space. You've also got other players like Jamal Crawford with his handles, Ben Wallace's interior defense, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's skyhook. These players have dedicated much time and effort into perfecting a very particular skill, and each of these represents mastery of something that only exists and only makes sense within the game itself. And then you have players who don't just dominate at one skill, but can impact the game in almost any way on any given night. Nikola Jokic routinely sits within the top 5 in season averages for points, rebounds, assists, and steals. If you've ever seen this Serbian play, you know he's not the flashiest player. Like, just as an example, like I remember watching a Nuggets game against, I think it was the Timberwolves. And I was sitting there thinking, man, it must not be the Joker's night. Not really sure what he's been doing all game. Just to check ESPN and find out that he had 10 rebounds and it wasn't even the end of the first quarter yet. I mean, this guy just understands the game at an absurdly deep level. And there's also this kind of excellence that barely shows up on the stat sheets at all, which is what most players refer to as basketball IQ. You've got players like Chris Paul and Rajon Rondo, or Chris Paul and Rajon Rondo, depending on who you ask, and they've famously called out opposing plays before they've even happened. That's not raw athleticism, that's an encyclopedic understanding of the game. And then you've got other players like LeBron who just are casually reciting entire game sequences from memory in post-game interviews like it's nothing. Like, This is not just talent, it's total immersion in the practice. You just gotta see this. So, bringing back Alistair McIntyre for a second, McIntyre describes activities like sports as a practice. Again, the shared cooperative human activities with their own internal standards of excellence. What this means is that a practice is not just something that people do, it's something people do together, under shared rules with a shared understanding of what counts as doing it well. And crucially, the most important goods of a practice only exist inside that activity. You can't get them anywhere else. You can't buy Tom Brady's passing ability. You can't fake Mike Tyson's raw strength, speed, and right hook. You can't extract Serena Williams' powerful serve and forehand and apply it meaningfully outside of tennis. These forms of excellence don't transfer cleanly into money, power, or survival. They only make sense within the game itself, and you only get them through hard work, grit, and determination. This is what McIntyre means by internal goods. They're not rewards tacked on from the outside. They're not trophies or contracts or endorsements. They're the skills, virtues, and forms of recognition that only exist because the practice exists. You only understand them if you participate seriously or at least know what excellence looks like from the inside. This is also why sports generate such strong moral reactions. When someone cheats, it doesn't just feel unfair, it feels like a category error. They're trying to get the benefits of the practice without actually participating in it. They want the appearance of excellence without submitting to the standards that define excellence in the first place. And this helps us explain something important about modern sports culture. Because you have institutions, the leagues, the corporations, the media, and all of these things are necessary to keep sports going. You need money, organization, and infrastructure. But those institutions are always tempted to prioritize the external goods, such as profit, branding, winning at all costs, marketability. And when that happens, the practice starts to hollow out. The game certainly still exists, but its point becomes confused. What McIntyre gives us then is a way to say something precise about this matter, which is that sports matter not because they entertain us, and not even primarily because they produce winners, but because they sustain practices where excellence, discipline, fairness, and mutual recognition are still intelligible in some way. They are places where achievement means something because of how it was achieved and not simply because it happened. And once you see sports this way, winning stops being the ultimate justification. Winning only matters insofar as it emerges from respect for the practice itself, and when it doesn't, the very thing winning was supposed to prove disappears. This is also why cheating feels worse than just breaking rules. Outside of sports, rules are often broken to achieve some other end. A mother might steal food to feed her child. A billionaire might exploit legal loopholes for financial gain. We can argue about those cases, but at least the rule breaking aims at something beyond the violation itself. Cheating in sports, especially at amateur or local levels, is just different because there's usually no real external payoff. There's no money, no survival benefit, just the illusion of winning and the denial of others succeeding. And that win isn't even real because it undermines the very condition that make winning meaningful in the first place. So, a cheater isn't just breaking a rule, they're refusing to participate in the shared practice everyone else agreed to uphold. They're putting their own ego above the game and their own pride above other human beings. Obviously, at the professional level, things get a little bit messier because the external goods like money, fame, and legacy are everywhere, but even there, we instinctively know when something has gone wrong. Lance Armstrong didn't just break cycling rules, he hollowed out the achievement itself, and there's no amount of charity work that's going to restore the integrity that was lost there. Which brings us to the final question, which is, when does winning destroy the thing that it's supposed to justify? I would argue that sports are best understood as a form of social contract, and that is to say that they are a voluntary, mutual agreement to pursue a goal under shared constraints. The rules are constitutive of the practice, and violating them undermines the agreement itself. Once those rules are accepted, they function non-instrumentally within the practice. Players don't justify obedience by appealing to outcomes, excitement, or advantage because the rules define what it even means to succeed. In that sense, sports can kind of feel deontological from the inside, but I still think that social contract theory is a better ethical theory analogy here. But regardless, this might be why sports provoke such strong moral reactions. They aren't just games we watch, they're shared practices where excellence, fairness, and meaning only exist if everyone agrees to protect them. And this is why I think sports are valuable, because they are, again, one of the few places where this kind of integrity is still publicly valued and protected. Now, I don't think sports are just entertainment, because if they were, none of this would happen. People wouldn't scream at referees. Players wouldn't start fights. Fans wouldn't feel personally betrayed by decisions that have no direct impact on their lives. That is, unless, of course, they're betting on stakes or something. Don't do that. But sports provoke intense emotional reactions by design, not by accident. That intensity is structural. Just to give you a very vivid example, we can examine the case of running up the score. You've seen this before. Imagine you've got two teams competing and one team is just completely eviscerating the other, right? It's a total domination. Is it wrong to keep scoring? The answer isn't simple here because it kind of depends on the context. How much time is left? What kind of comeback is realistically possible? In the NFL, we've seen enormous leads evaporate, so continuing to play aggressively can be justified. Watching the Falcons blow a 25-point lead can make any man say that no lead is truly safe. But at a certain point, especially at amateur or high school levels, something changes when a game turns into a humiliation ritual where you're just continuing to pile on. That feels wrong even if it's technically legal. And notice what's doing the moral work here. It's not the rule book, but an implicit understanding of what the game is for at that level. At the professional level, things get murkier in this regard. Players have contract incentives that are often tied to points, yards, or goals. When you have players that chase statistical milestones, like, I don't know, Bam Adebayo scoring 83 points, when they're up 30 points in the fourth quarter and they're just fouling and what are we doing here? Nothing that happened in that game against the Wizards broke any formal rule, but it still provoked a lot of anger to some people because many players and fans sense that something outside the practice has intruded. The action prioritizes ego, money, or optics over the shared understanding of how the game ought to be played once its competitive meaning has subsided. I think this reveals a very important distinction, which is that sports operate under two kinds of norms. First, there are the formal rules, the explicit written constraints that everyone is obligated to follow. Break those, and the penalties are automatic. But secondly, there are these informal or implicit norms, the shared expectations about respect, restraint, effort, and integrity. Those aren't written down, but everyone who actually understands the game knows when they've been violated. Most sports conflicts live in that second space, or perhaps some strange combination of both. I'm sure that you've probably heard of the infamous Malice at the Palace fight. The incident didn't begin with fans throwing drinks, it started on the court. Ron Artest committed a hard foul, a violation of a formal rule, but hard fouls occupy this morally charged gray area in sports. They're sometimes part of legitimate competition, but when they're done intentionally and excessively, they carry a risk of injury and an added meaning of disrespect to the player. That implicit violation is what triggered Ben Wallace's response. The conflict escalated not because a rule was broken, that happens constantly, but because the act signaled a rejection of the mutual restraint that makes physical competition tolerable in the first place. This is a very common phenomenon in the ethical life. Sometimes the ethicality of an action doesn't always align with its legality. Disrespect is not against the rules by any means, and players trash talk all game long. But I think most people can recognize why certain actions that break no rules at all can provoke these equally intense reactions. This is why I think ring chasing and super teams provoke such strong, visceral reactions. You've got Kevin Durant joining the Warriors, LeBron James joining the Miami Heat, Kevin Durant joining the Nets, the New York Yankees in just about any decade that you choose, Kevin Durant joining the Suns. These moves violate no rules, and yet fans routinely describe them as hollow, weak, or disrespectful. Fans overwhelmingly value championship runs like Dirk Nowitzki's with the Dallas Mavericks more than rings won with these totally stacked rosters. Hell, sometimes you don't even have to win the whole thing. We love a good Cinderella story. Every March, that's what we look forward to the most, is it not? The underdogs, they're looked back on with cherishment because how you win matters more than the outcome alone. And this explains why disrespect often feels worse than losing, because losing within the practice still affirms it. Disrespect just undermines it. When a player runs up the score for ego or to break a record, when they join super teams to bypass competition, or they treat opponents as props rather than participants, they're not just being unsportsmanlike, they're rejecting the cooperative essence of the practice itself. And this also helps explain why fans feel so personally offended by player decisions. When an athlete joins a team, they don't just sign a contract. They enter a complicated web of expectations to teammates, to coaches, organizations, and to fans. Fans invest identity, loyalty, and emotion into the team, and in return, they expect effort, commitment, and respect for the shared project. When players leave in ways that seem to abandon that project, fans experience it as a kind of betrayal, not because they own the player, but because a relationship of mutual investment has been broken. Of course, this cuts both ways. Fans also have ethical obligations. Events like the NHL shoe incident come to mind here, and there's also Utah Jazz fans being routinely racist, or more recent acts of misogynistic harassment like throwing sex toys onto WNBA courts. Heckling within the game is one thing, harassment, racism, and sexual degradation are quite another. Up to this point, I've been criticizing what happens when external goods are dragged into a sport. Players chasing fame, money, legacy, betting lines, fans importing grudges, tribal hatreds, or personal resentments that have nothing to do with the game itself. In those cases, something genuinely goes wrong. The practice starts to bend around these incentives and passions that are logically unrelated to the activity. But politics, as I'm going to argue, are different in a very fundamental way. And the key difference is this. External goods are optional to the practice. Political identity is not optional to the person. When a player chases a stat line, a contract incentive, or a betting outcome, they are subordinating the internal goods of the sport to something that exists entirely outside it. Those motivations are very detachable. You could remove them and you would still have the same player, the same person, the same human being. Politics doesn't work that way. Political commitments are not add-ons like money or accolades. They're expressions of how a person understands justice, dignity, responsibility, and social belonging. You don't step out of those commitments when you put on a uniform any more than you step out of your moral agency, your race, your religion, or your personal history. And this is why bringing external incentives into a sport often corrupts it, while bringing political expression into a sport doesn't automatically do so. One treats the game as a means to an unrelated end, the other treats the game as a public space in which a person already exists. Take Allen Iverson, for example. Iverson wasn't punished for cheating or throwing games or disrespecting opponents, though he did sometimes disrespect his opponents. He was punished for bringing black culture into the NBA's public image. Dress codes, media narratives, fines. All of this was framed as professionalism, even though what was really being policed was how a black athlete was allowed to exist in a public space. Even in the case of Colin Kaepernick, it's a little bit complicated. He didn't alter the rules of football. He didn't compromise competitive integrity. He just knelt during the national anthem to protest racial injustice and was effectively blackballed from the league. At the same time, mind you, the owners of NFL teams are free to donate millions and millions of dollars to political campaigns, lobby behind closed doors, and shape public policy with zero professional consequences. Politics were and always have been there, just quietly, selectively, in ways that often preserve power. So there's a massive asymmetry here. That asymmetry becomes even more clear when you look at the media reactions to these events. Laura Ingraham famously told LeBron James to shut up and dribble after he spoke out about racial issues, only for a few years to pass, and she then defended Drew Brees as being entitled to his opinion when in June 2020 he stated he'd never agree with anybody disrespecting the flag.
Well, he's allowed to have his view about what kneeling and the flag means to him. I mean, he's a person. He has some worth, I would imagine. I mean, this is beyond football, though. This is totalitarian conduct. This is Stalinist. And by the way, on the streets of New Orleans, we're looking at live pictures. They're shouting, F Drew Brees.
So what changed, Laura? It certainly wasn't the principle of free speech. No. What changed was who was speaking, about what, and in which direction. So this is why the claim that politics should be kept out of sports just doesn't survive contact with reality. Politics are already embedded in sports, in the ownership, branding, patriotism, labor relations, race, and money. So what people usually mean is not no politics, but no politics that challenge the existing moral comfort of the audience. And that's an entirely different moral question. But I do want to be a little bit fair here. Free expression absolutely cuts both ways. Athletes do not lose their right to speak because they're good at a game, and fans do not lose their right to disagree because they bought a ticket. I think LeBron James is deeply wrong for his comments about political issues between China and Taiwan. I think Drew Brees was deeply misguided in his public political views. None of that requires denying their right to speak. Criticism is simply a part of public discourse, and silence is not a condition of participation in a game. The ethical line is not disagreement. The line is selective silencing and, honestly, dehumanization. When a player rigs a game for betting purposes, they're instrumentalizing the practice itself and effectively hollowing out what it actually means to play a game. But when a player kneels during an anthem, wears a symbol, or speaks out about racial injustice, they're not just using the game to get something else. They are expressing who they are while participating in the practice. Those are logically different acts, even if both make people uncomfortable. So the real question here isn't about whether sports should be pure or neutral or apolitical. They never have been. The question is whether those voices are treated as legitimate expressions of personhood and whether or not they're treated as disruptions. By now, I hope it's become abundantly clear that sports ethics can't be reduced to any single controversy. The same underlying questions keep resurfacing in different forms. What counts as legitimate advantage? When does innovation become manipulation? When does competition slide into exploitation? Who or what is being used as a means, and who bears the cost? This is why ethical debates in sports are so persistent and so hard to settle. They aren't just about rule breaking. They're about how practices respond when new incentives, technologies, institutions, or pressures press on the internal standards. So rather than try to resolve any of these debates once and for all, I want to do something a little bit more modest here and just basically move through a series of recurring fault lines in modern sports ethics. We're going to move through all of these not to declare winners, but just to show how philosophy helps us see what's actually at stake in each case. One of the oldest and most persistent ethical debates in sports is about performance enhancement. Athletes have always tried to get better through training, diet, equipment, medicine, and now increasingly sophisticated technology. The hard question isn't whether enhancement happens, but which kinds of enhancement belongs inside of the practice of sport and which ones undermine it. Most discussions focus on performance-enhancing drugs, or PEDs. But philosophically, this debate is much broader. It cuts to the heart of what sport is for and what we think athletic excellence actually consists in. Very roughly, there are three major positions in the PED debate. The first is the pro-doping view, and on this account, using performance-enhancing substances is not morally different from using other technologies we already accept, like better shoes, lighter bikes, advanced training methods, even medical procedures like LASIK eye surgery. Humans are tool-using creatures after all. We constantly modify ourselves to achieve our goals, and from this perspective, banning PEDs looks kind of arbitrary. If the point of sport is to push human performance as far as possible, then biological enhancement isn't a betrayal of sports, it's an expression of the same impulse that drives innovation everywhere else. The second position is the anti-doping view, which is probably the one that you're most familiar with. Here, PEDs are seen as undermining sport in one or many ways. Some argue that enhancement corrodes the very idea of athletic excellence by shifting the focus from skill, discipline, and training to chemical optimization. Others emphasize fairness. Access to PEDs is always unequal, and their use pressures all competitors to follow suit just to remain competitive. But there are also concerns about health, especially in environments where athletes, often young athletes, may feel coerced into dangerous practices. Still, others object on more philosophical grounds, arguing that doping violates values like authenticity, naturalness, or respect for the human body. Then there's a third position that often gets overlooked entirely, which is the anti-doping view, and here advocates may agree in principle that doping is undesirable, but they argue that the way that we try to prevent it is morally worse than the problem itself. Modern anti-doping regimes involve constant surveillance, invasive testing, strict liability rules, and institutions that increasingly resemble criminal justice systems. So on this view, the cost, whether it be financial, moral, or personal, of policing doping is too high, the success rate too low, and the underlying assumptions too shaky. Rather than absolute bans, these critics often propose harm reduction models, partial legalization, or alternative regulatory frameworks. What makes the PED debate so revealing is that all three sides appeal to values we already care about: excellence, fairness, autonomy, health, and integrity. The disagreement isn't about whether those values matter, it's about which values should take priority and how they should be built into the structure of the sport itself. And this is why I think the debate will really never go away, because PEDs aren't just about drugs. They're about what we think sport is supposed to test, and whether the line between human achievement and technological assistance was ever as clear as we pretended it to be. Now, a very similar debate plays out around technology in sports. Like performance enhancement, technology can either support the practice or completely reshape it, and the ethical tension usually turns on where that technology is allowed to operate. Some technological advances are almost universally welcomed. You have training tools, analytics, improved surfaces, better recovery equipment, or even devices that help players refine skills such as ball handling, passing, or timing. And all of these function outside of the moment of competition. They don't perform the skill for the athlete, they help the athlete develop the skill, and in those cases, the technology supports excellence rather than substituting for it. If you're really interested in seeing how much impact modern technology has on sports, I highly recommend watching Michael McKelvey's video called Fewest World Records Ever, Humans Have Athletically Peaked. It helped me a lot in preparing for this video, and It's just such a phenomenal channel. I highly recommend it. But moving on, the ethical problems tend to arise when technology is used inside the game itself. Consider the case of carbon fiber tennis rackets. They dramatically increased power, spin, and forgiveness compared to wooden rackets. And this changes not just how hard players can hit the ball, but what styles of play were viable. Or think about more recent controversies, such as the one in Major League Baseball, where they have these unusually engineered baseball bats. And these kinds of bats have raised questions about whether equipment is amplifying performance in ways that the sport never intended. In both cases, no skill is eliminated, but the distribution of difficulty is certainly altered. So philosophically speaking, technology becomes ethically suspect when it begins to do the work that the game is supposed to test. If success increasingly depends on access to superior equipment rather than the mastery of the skill that the rules were designed to isolate, then the internal standards of excellence start to shift. The game might still be playable, but it becomes unclear what exactly it's rewarding. That doesn't mean that all in-game technology is bad. Rules have always evolved alongside tools. The question is not whether technology changes sports, but whether it changes them in ways that preserve the core challenge or replaces it. This is why debates about equipment feel so similar in structure to debates about PEDs. Both force us to ask where the boundary lies between enhancing human performance and replacing the human element altogether. And as with doping, there is no obvious place to draw the line that isn't at least somewhat arbitrary. But what philosophy can do here is clarify the stakes. Technology isn't a problem simply because it's new or powerful. It becomes a problem when it shifts the focus of achievement away from the athlete and toward the apparatus. One of the most famous ethics scandals in modern American sports is by far Deflategate. And if you're like me, who don't really closely follow the NFL, you assumed for years that it was a closed case, that Tom Brady was basically caught in 4K red-handed kissing his son and deflating footballs. But it turns out that the story is much cleaner than reality. At the center of the controversy was whether footballs used by the New England Patriots in the 2015 AFC Championship game were intentionally underinflated below league standards, potentially giving quarterbacks a grip advantage. The NFL's investigation concluded that it was more probable than not that Brady was at least generally aware of equipment staff actions, but that standard, more probable than not, that's really important here because it's not proof beyond a reasonable doubt that you might see in courts or something. It's not even especially strong proof. The evidence itself was deeply contested. Several independent scientists criticized the NFL's failure to adequately account for natural pressure loss due to temperature changes. Other quarterbacks openly stated that ball pressure preferences varied widely and were inconsistently enforced across the league. And even the league's own data was, at best, inconclusive. So why punish Brady anyway? This is where Deflategate becomes less about footballs and more about institutional ethics. The NFL ultimately suspended Brady not for simply deflating footballs, but for failing to fully cooperate with the investigation, including the destruction of a personal cell phone. That move allowed the league to reframe the punishment as enforcement of authority rather than an adjudication of guilt, and the courts later upheld that suspension not because Brady was proven to have cheated, but because the league had broad discretion under its collective bargaining agreement to discipline players as it saw fit. In other words, the legal question wasn't did Brady do it, but does the NFL have the power to punish him anyway? And this is very ethically important to the discussion because if Brady did knowingly cheat, then punishment makes sense under almost any framework we've discussed so far. But if the case is genuinely ambiguous, and there are good reasons to think that it was, then punishment starts to look less like justice and more like deterrence theater. A message sent to the league saying, we are in control and someone will pay the price. Now, this actually brings up a very famous ethical dilemma in the ethical theory known as utilitarianism. In classical utilitarianism, They are concerned with optimistic outcomes. Actions are justified insofar that they genuinely maximize overall well-being. You'll hear the phrase utilitarian calculus, and this just means that you take the overall well-being that will be produced, you subtract the total amount of suffering that might be caused, and if the result is still a net positive, then you should probably do it. A philosopher by the name of H.J. McCloskey very famously created a counterexample to utilitarianism that maps pretty cleanly to the situation with Brady and Deflategate. And in the counterexample, what is called the sheriff counterexample, you're posed with the question, say that you are a sheriff. There was a crime that happened that will cause a riot, and you know ahead of time that the riots will cause mass property destruction and lives will presumably be lost. You have the opportunity to punish an innocent person for the sake of quelling the riots, but you do have to punish an innocent person. So do you do it? Do you punish the innocent person to prevent the property damage, to prevent the loss of other lives? Now, there are many utilitarians who are deeply suspicious of this kind of arbitrary punishment, precisely because unjust treatment erodes trust, legitimacy, and long-term social welfare. But there are still other utilitarians who do what is called biting the bullet and just say, yeah, I'd punish the innocent person because it saves lives. And it's important to note that utilitarianism isn't inherently authoritarian. It often gets associated that way, often by people who really don't know what utilitarianism is, but I digress. The important thing is that what we see in cases like Deflategate is something a little bit more narrow and I think more dangerous. It's a message-sending, authority-preserving form of institutional utilitarianism. The goal is not overall flourishing, but compliance. The calculus isn't, does this promote the greatest good, but does this reinforce control and deter future challenges to authority? And so in this way, this kind of reasoning often undermines even utilitarian goals in the long run. When punishment feels symbolic rather than just, the trust erodes. And when institutions prioritize optics over truth, they completely dismantle the very practice they claim to protect. Sports claim legitimacy by appealing to fairness, rule clarity, and equal treatment. When punishment becomes symbolic rather than evidentiary, when it's supposed to send a message rather than resolve responsibility, the practice risks undermining the very integrity that it's claiming to protect here. Deflategate, then, isn't just a scandal about cheating, it's a cautionary tale about administrative power in sports, and it shows just how easily leagues can slide from enforcing rules that define a practice to exercising authority that merely preserves appearances. And once that happens, the question shifts from who broke the rules to who decides what justice looks like when the truth is just inconvenient. This next controversy is one that I had to do a lot of researching in because I just simply had never heard of it before, mostly because I didn't keep up with these sports. The controversy surrounding Saudi money in global sport is not at its core about wealth, oil, or foreign investment as such. It's about state-backed investment in cultural institutions as a tool of reputational rehabilitation. Saudi Arabia is an absolute monarchy with a long and well-documented record of human rights abuses, including the suppression of political dissent, mass executions, severe restrictions on women's and LGBTQ rights, and the extrajudicial killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Against this background, Saudi investment in globally beloved sports has raised concerns that sport is being used as a vehicle to soften international perception, normalize diplomatic relationships, and redirect public attention away from ongoing repression at home. This practice is widely referred to as sports washing. Central to this controversy is the Public Investment Fund, Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund, which is wholly owned by the state and chaired by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. The PIF is not a neutral private investor. It operates as an arm of state policy, explicitly aligned with Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 agenda. Its scale and reach are very immense, and they control hundreds of billions of dollars in assets. And it has increasingly targeted sports as a strategic site of investment. This direct entanglement between political power, state wealth, and cultural prestige is what distinguishes Saudi sports investment from ordinary commercial sponsorship. Golf provides the most disruptive example. Through PIF funding, Saudi Arabia created Live Golf, a rival professional golf tour offering unprecedented guaranteed contracts to elite players. Live Golf did not merely enter the market, it attempted to restructure the moral economy of the sport, shifting value away from tradition, earned prestige, and competitive continuity toward sheer purchasing power. Critics argued that this move forced the athletes and institutions into a moral dilemma. Participation may be framed as just playing sport, yet it simultaneously lends legitimacy and cultural capital to a state seeking reputational repair. The controversy intensified when Live Golf and the PGA Tour announced plans to merge their commercial operations, effectively integrating Saudi state money into the very heart of professional golf. And Formula One represents a subtler but arguably deeper form of entanglement here. Saudi Arabia hosts the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix and has pursued expanding influence within the sport through these long-term hosting contracts and PIF investments in F1-related enterprises. Unlike golf, Saudi involvement in Formula One does not arrive as a hostile takeover, but woven into an already globalized system that routinely operates in authoritarian states and environmentally compromised contexts. This makes the ethical tension a lot harder to isolate because the concern is not merely that Saudi Arabia participates in F1, but that F1's dependence on global capital renders moral critique increasingly toothless. You'll hear the phrase blood money a lot in this conversation, and it's used by critics not as a rhetorical gimmick or a hyperbole, but to refer to the fact that these investments are materially linked to a state whose wealth is inseparable from documented human rights violations, and whose leadership has been credibly implicated in acts of political violence. In that sense, the controversy is not just about individual athletes' intentions or isolated events, but whether global sports institutions can maintain moral credibility when they become platforms for state-sponsored image management. Taken together, golf and Formula One illustrate two paths to the same ethical problem: overt disruption on one hand and quiet institutional absorption on the other. But in both cases, the central question is whether sport can still plausibly claim autonomy, moral, cultural, political, or otherwise, once it becomes an extension of state power rather than a center for shared human practice. Now, it would be far too simple to say that Saudi money in sports is uniquely evil, while Western money is morally neutral by default. That story just does not hold up with reality under any amount of scrutiny. In the United States, professional sports are deeply entangled with corporate power, political lobbying, and concentrated private wealth, as we've already kind of hinted at earlier. Team owners donate to political campaigns, fund advocacy groups, lobby legislators, and exert very real influence over public policy. Stadiums are often publicly subsidized, labor laws are bent, cities compete to accommodate billionaires, and none of this is morally clean. So yes, there is a meaningful sense in which many of the criticisms leveled at Saudi-backed sports investments can also be directed at American and European sports institutions. Power uses sport everywhere. Money shapes legitimacy everywhere. No major league operates in a vacuum in that way. Where the Saudi case differs is not that the wrongdoing suddenly appears, but that the relationship between money, state power, and repression is far more direct. In Saudi Arabia, sports investment flows straight from the state itself, specifically through sovereign wealth funds that are inseparable from an absolute monarchy. The same institutions that bankroll global sporting spectacles are tied directly to a political system that criminalizes dissent, suppresses women's autonomy, persecutes LGBTQ people, and, in documented cases, murders critics. There's no meaningful separation between private investor and political authority because the money is not adjacent to power. It is power. Now, by contrast, in the United States, the relationship is more diffused and mediated. Team owners are private actors operating within nominally democratic systems. Their political influence is real, often troubling and sometimes corrosive, but it's filtered through these legal structures, corporate veils, campaign finance laws, courts, and competing institutions. That doesn't absolve them of their responsibility, but it does change the moral texture of the relationship. In my own state of Kansas, Governor Laura Kelly recently announced a deal to bring the Kansas City Chiefs across the state line, funded largely through public mechanisms like star bonds and state-backed incentives. The pitch is rather familiar. Economic growth, job creation, national visibility. But the underlying question is harder to ignore. Why is a franchise worth billions of dollars, owned by one of the wealthiest families in American sports, being subsidized by public money at all? Especially when this deal comes after the most successful era in the team's history and not before it. Whatever economic benefits are promised, the costs are very real. The public funds are going to be tied up for decades, increased pressure on local infrastructure is inevitable, and there's a very real possibility looming over everyone's head that the surrounding neighborhoods and small businesses are going to be priced out of existence. Now, this is purely anecdotal, but everyone that I personally know from the Kansas City area is furious about this, not because they hate the Chiefs, but because they recognize the pattern. Cities compete to please billionaires, the risk is socialized while all of the rewards are privatized, and once again, a shared civic good is treated as leverage in a negotiation where ordinary people have no real power. And this frustration is exacerbated by the figure at the center of the deal, Clark Hunt. And he's often presented as this quiet, respectable steward of the franchise, but his record complicates that image. He is one of the richest owners in American sports, yet repeatedly seeks public financing for private ventures. Under his ownership, the NFL has faced criticism for its handling of domestic violence cases, labor disputes, and player discipline, policies that protect the league's image while often leaving players and communities to absorb the consequences. Hunt has also faced lawsuits over failed investment deals and has been criticized for his role in maintaining league structures that prioritize profit and brand stability over accountability. None of this makes him uniquely villainous. In fact, that's exactly the point that I'm trying to make here. He's not an aberration. He is, in a very real sense, a representative case. What makes Clark Hunt a philosophically useful example is not that he's uniquely corrupt. He isn't. But the fact that this pattern, it shows up everywhere, and it's how sports become tools of legitimacy everywhere. Whether it's a sovereign wealth fund underwriting a global league or a Midwestern state issuing state bonds to attract a billionaire-owned franchise, the ethical concern between both shares a familiar shape even if they're not morally identical. When a practice that's supposed to be about excellence, competition, and shared meaning becomes a mechanism for laundering power, prestige, or political capital, something essential is lost. The uniforms might stay the same, the games might still get played, but the moral burden quietly shifts onto the public, who are then told that we need to be grateful for the spectacle that we were asked to write a check for. And I think that this distinction allows us to say a couple things at once here without any contradiction. First, that sports washing is not uniquely Saudi, and that Western sports are already compromised by capital, politics, and inequality. And secondly, that Saudi-backed sports investment represents a more extreme case because the legitimacy is being purchased directly by a state whose political authority and human rights records are not meaningfully separated from the investment itself. Holding both truths together avoids two common failures. On one side, it avoids the xenophobic moral panic that treats non-Western actors as uniquely corrupt, which I think is very important with the ongoing war in Iran. And on the other, it avoids moral complacency that treats Western sports institutions as ethically neutral by comparison. And crucially, I think this entire framing keeps the focus where it belongs. not on identifying villains, but on understanding what happens to a practice when legitimacy becomes something that can be bought rather than earned. And that question applies everywhere. Saudi Arabia simply makes it impossible to ignore. Okay, moving on. Some sports raise ethical questions not because of money, technology, or politics, but because they involve non-human participants. Hunting, fishing, big game trophy hunts, and endurance races like the Iditarod force us to confront a more basic moral problem. Who counts, morally speaking, when we decide that something is worth doing for sport? This is where animal ethics enters the conversation, and where thinkers like Peter Singer and Alistair Norcross are especially useful. In Animal Liberation, Peter Singer, who is a utilitarian, argues that the capacity for suffering, not intelligence, rationality, language, or anything like that, is what grounds moral consideration. If a being can experience pain, fear, distress, or pleasure, then its interests matter morally. Perhaps not in the same way that human interests matter, not with the same rights, but they matter nonetheless. Before I continue, there are other philosophers in this space, such as Carl Cohen, who argue against people like Singer, but I'll save that discussion for a dedicated animal rights video that I'm still currently writing. Now, this distinction is crucial because it often gets lost in these bad faith discussions. Extending moral consideration to animals does not mean the same thing as granting them identical rights to humans. A dog has no interest in voting. A fish has no interest in the freedom of speech. But both have a very real interest in avoiding suffering. Ignoring that interest simply because they are not humans is what Singer famously calls speciesism, a bias that is structurally similar to racism or sexism, where morally irrelevant traits are used to discount suffering. And if you take that idea very seriously, sports involving animals looks ethically different from sports involving only consenting human participants. Take hunting and fishing, for example. These practices are often defended on ecological grounds, and sometimes rightly so. In places like my home state of Kansas, population control is not hypothetical. Deer overpopulation increases car accidents and human fatalities. Coyotes, if left entirely unmanaged, can destabilize local ecosystems and livestock populations. Regulated hunting can serve legitimate environmental ends, and pretending otherwise without feasible alternatives turns animal ethics into a moral performance rather than a serious analysis. But ecological justification is not the same thing as sporting justification. Hunting as population control and hunting as recreation are morally distinct activities, even if they involve the same physical act. The former can be tragic but necessary, whereas the latter risks treating animal suffering as entertainment. It's kind of similar to how murder is distinct from killing in self-defense. From an animal ethics perspective, the key question is not whether humans ever kill animals, but whether unnecessary suffering is being inflicted for reasons that could be otherwise satisfied. And this is where broader debates about meat consumption and alternatives become relevant, not as moral purity tests, but as pressure on justification. Humanity could feasibly survive on plant-based diets and plant-based alternatives. The infrastructure and culture would take time to change, that's, without a doubt, but the existence of viable alternatives weakens the claim that large-scale animal suffering is somehow unavoidable. Factory farming in particular represents suffering on a scale that dwarfs hunting and fishing combined, and any honest discussion of animal sports has to acknowledge that wider context. Still, though, there are a lot of worthwhile discussions to have here. Big game trophy hunting, for instance. Defenders often argue that trophy hunting funds conservation, or that if wealthy foreigners didn't hunt these animals, local populations would just do it anyway. But I think this framing mistakes cause for effect here. The demand for these experiences is overwhelmingly driven by Western consumerism. The fact that conservation money is routed through spectacle doesn't transform killing for prestige into a moral good. At best, it is a morally compromised workaround for a problem created by global inequality and demand. At worst, it treats animals purely as means, valuable only insofar as their deaths can be monetized. That's pretty untenable in my opinion. Endurance races involving animals raise similar concerns, albeit from a different angle. Events like the Iditarod are not about killing, but about pushing animals, often thousands of miles through very extreme conditions for human competition and prestige. Even with veterinary oversight and improved safety standards, dogs are not voluntary participants in the way that human athletes are. They cannot consent to the risks imposed on them. Documented injuries, exhaustion, and deaths force a very hard question here. Are these burdens justified by the animal's interests or only by ours? Golf raises another problem that is no less serious, with the set of animal concerns through its environmental footprint. Modern golf courses require vast amounts of land, water, chemical treatment, and they're often replacing complex ecosystems with carefully managed monocultures. Wetlands are drained, native grasses are removed, and wildlife habitats are fragmented or eliminated altogether to maintain fairways and greens that meet professional standards. The routine use of pesticides and fertilizers poses risks to birds, insects, amphibians, and nearby waterways, while excessive water consumption, especially in arid regions, creates long-term ecological stress. This is built into the structure of the sport as it is currently practiced. From an animal ethics perspective, the issue isn't whether golf is uniquely destructive, but whether aesthetic and recreational preferences justify sustained harm to surrounding ecosystems and the non-human lives that depend on them. When sport reshapes entire habitats for the sake of play, the moral cost extends far beyond the boundaries of the course. Now, you have to remember, sport at its core is a voluntary practice structured around unnecessary obstacles. Animals simply do not volunteer. That doesn't automatically make every animal-involved sport immoral, but it does shift the burden of proof. Tradition alone is not enough, and neither are enjoyment or economic benefits. What animal ethics ultimately demands is not abolition overnight, but honesty. If animals matter morally, and it's increasingly difficult to deny that they do, then sports involving them must meet stricter ethical standards than sports involving only consenting humans. Suffering counts wherever it appears, and if we take sport seriously as a moral practice rather than a mere source of entertainment, we cannot exempt it from that demand without contradiction. That apprehension may not give us any easy answers, but it does tell us where the line of inquiry has to begin. I know debates like the ones that we just steamrolled through can feel very exhausting. They're emotionally charged, morally complex, and rarely, if ever, do they leave anyone satisfied. But that difficulty isn't a failure of sports. It's a fundamental feature of them. Just as society places difficult boundaries on people, often implicit ones, sports place difficult boundaries on participants. And those boundaries don't exist to make life easier. They exist to make meaning possible. Yes, living is hard. Bodies differ, circumstances differ, luck is uneven. No rule system in sports or in society will ever produce perfect fairness. And yet, it's precisely within those constraints that things like achievement, justice, care, and responsibility become truly special. None of those qualities exist in a vacuum. They only emerge when something is at stake. And this is why I think sports matter philosophically. Sports ask us to voluntarily step into systems of limitation. We accept goals that don't need to exist and rules that deliberately make success harder than it needs to be. We could walk instead of running a timed mile. We could pick up the ball instead of dribbling it. We could remove offside rules, weight classes, time limits, and scoreboards. But if we did that, the activity would lose its point. The difficulty then is not a malfunction, it's the entire point. This is what I think thinkers like Bernard Suits were getting at when they described games as the voluntary acceptance of unnecessary obstacles. By agreeing to struggle under these shared constraints, we transform effort into excellence and failure into information. And this is why sports are so uniquely suited to moral education. They teach us how to occupy roles, how to accept responsibility that is almost never evenly distributed, how to subordinate ego to collective purpose, how to win without domination and lose without losing yourself. They teach us fairness as commitment to shared rules, even when those rules disadvantage us personally. They also teach us something more subtle, how to care deeply about something without needing it to justify your entire existence. Sports create these high emotional stakes with very low existential cost. You can give everything you have. You can leave everything out on the court and still walk away intact. Far from being trivial, it is practice for life itself. This is why so many of the hardest ethical questions surface in sports. They're miniature worlds, condensed versions of the problems we face everywhere else in life. All of it shows up here because sports are one of the few places where these tensions are made visible and unavoidable. People often say, "It's just a game," as a way to deflate the intensity that surrounds sports. The anger, the devotion, the heartbreak, the fights in the stands, and the silence after a loss. But if sports were really just games, distractions, interchangeable with any other form of entertainment, none of that would make sense. The very existence of sport tells us something important about what we as human beings value. We don't seek comfort, efficiency, or survival alone. We seek challenge. We seek standards. We seek situations where effort matters, where excellency can be recognized, where loss hurts but never destroys us. We willingly submit ourselves to constraints, not because we enjoy suffering, but because without constraint, meaning disintegrates altogether. And this is why a society that abandons play would struggle to explain itself. Without games, without practices that make difficulty intelligible, it becomes harder to say why perseverance matters, why fairness matters, why integrity matters when outcomes are uncertain and bodies are unequal. Sports give us shared arenas where these values are not abstract ideals, but lived experiences. They teach us how to care without needing everything to be existentially decisive. The pandemic revealed this in a way that no philosophical argument probably could. When sports disappeared, what people mourned was not entertainment, it was ritual, shared struggle. It was the chance to invest effort and identity into something serious but survivable. The question, why do we need this, turned out to be easier to answer once sports were gone. And maybe that's the final note I'll leave you with. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Adrian Parle. I'm a small mind in a small room, and I'll see you in the next video.